Okay, here's our overview of, quote, students will explore Gandhi's nonviolent nationalist movement and nationalist efforts led by the Muslim League aimed at the masses that resulted in British partitioned subcontinent. Okay, defining the words. Gandhi, he was a nationalist leader. Nonviolent, using no violent means. Nationalist movement, that means people of a nation coming together to do something, usually to expel foreign rule. And nationalist efforts by the Muslim League, a political group aimed at the masses, the people of India, that resulted in a British, the owners of India, partitioned, divided subcontinent. The subcontinent is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. The whole area is the subcontinent. Partition means divided. Okay, so when last we left India, India was fully under political control of the British, called the Raj, the British rule. And that was in the late 1800s. So we're going to pick it up in the early 1900s. Three groups started to try to work for independence from British and getting their own rule, home rule, and then independence back for India. One was the Indian National Congress, a political group. One was the Muslim League, which was eventually run by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And a third was a movement led by the man Mohandas Gandhi, often called the Mahatma, meaning great soul. So we have three concurrent leaders working together to try to remove the British from India. We have a Muslim League because the Indian National Congress was majority Hindu, and the rich, politically active Muslims didn't believe that they could have a significant voice because Hindu was the majority religion, Islam was the minority religion, and that they couldn't have a significant voice, so they had their own religious political group. And Mohandas Gandhi was Hindu, but in his actions and his speech, he was accepting of religion, so he didn't put identity based on religion ahead of identity based on Indian, so he was encompassing of all religions. So the major events that were important in the independence, starting with World War I in the early 1900s, and many Indians fought for the British, and the British used India as a source of taxes and raw materials for the war. And so India was economically hurt, and physically they had people fighting the war, and India was promised a degree of home rule and independence after the war in exchange for all the material and manpower help with the war. The British went back on the promise, and India never gained independence. And in fact, when people were angry at that, the British passed Rowlatt Acts, which removed Indians' rights of protest and removed civil rights of Indians. This led up to a mass gathering of Indians protesting the Rowlatt Acts and how it infringed upon their civil rights. And one of the British commanders ordered the soldiers to fire into the unarmed protesting group. It was firing with advanced guns for multiple minutes, and in the end, almost 400 people were killed, and then this was called the Amritsar Massacre. So we see the sacrifices made in World War I and then the broken promises make Indians angry at the British, and this would be, we would call it fueling nationalist ideas, fueling nationalism for independence. The Rowlatt Acts also angered Indians, furthering nationalism. And if anyone was on the fence before, the actual British killing of 400 peaceful Indians enraged the average Indian, further fueling the British Get Out Indian independence movement. Going forward, India went down a road of non-violent protests. There was a non-violent movement. There was a choice, a conscious choice, of whether to resist the British with revolution and violence, or to resist the British and make it economically and politically difficult to rule India, so they leave. This movement, mostly championed by Gandhi, was called Satyagraha, or Truth Force. The idea that they had the right, they had the moral high ground, they were in the correct, and so if they non-violently stood to their protests, they would eventually win. And this movement mostly contained boycotts, boycott British goods, and we could see this through the homespun movement, where many Indians made their own clothes and didn't buy the British imports, costing the British money. Paying no taxes, so the British couldn't get money through taxes, and disobeying non-just laws. The more laws that were disobeyed non-violently, the more it would cost the British in manpower and money to enforce the laws. And thousands of British police enforcers just can't control millions of Indians disobeying non-just laws. One major event was called the Salt March, because there were taxes on salt, and Indians were not allowed to make their own salt. They had to buy the British-made salt and pay high taxes on it. Gandhi walked over 200 miles, from 200 miles inland, to the ocean coast. He walked multiple miles a day, but he did it on a slow pace, and this march was designed to be broadcast by media all over the world, not just India, but all over the world. And by doing it slowly over 20-some days, over 200 miles, he was able to get lots of coverage and get his message out, and many people were following it, and it wasn't live back then, but it became, people were waiting for the next installments of Gandhi's march to finally find out what would happen when he reached the sea. What happened is he made salt in defiance of the British. And this spread the word. So everybody, not just in India, but the world, knew what the Indians wanted and what they were doing, which is non-violently resisting the British. So finally, the last major event that really ended the British rule of India was World War II. World War II was devastating to the English. Once again, the resources of India went to help the British fight the war, and millions of Indians volunteered to fight alongside the British. I think it was 2 million this time. And once again, there was talk about giving India independence after the war. Whether the independence was going to be given or not, it was absolutely moot in the end, because Britain was so devastated after the war, even though victorious, that they didn't have any resources to hold on to India, part of the empire. India was further costing the British money. The British were already bankrupt after the war. Holding on to India, India wasn't making them money anymore, so it was costing money to hold on to India. The movements, the nationalist movements of desire for independence were at a height, led by the Muslim League, Indian National Congress, and Mohandas Gandhi, and there was no way that England could hold on to India. Also further, England just finished fighting a war of survival against Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler's goal was to imperialize all of Europe. So right after World War II, England just fought a war, basically a war to keep themselves independent from an imperializer. So after World War II, it looks pretty bad if they themselves were continuing to imperialize a country that didn't want to be ruled. So within 2 years of the end of World War II, the British left, and India was partitioned. It was decided by the political leaders that the Hindu majority would stay in India and the Muslim minority would get lands to later becoming Pakistan and later Bangladesh. And the reason being that the political leaders thought that was the best way to ensure representation of the different religions in the governments. Now, Mohandas Gandhi wanted a unified India. The British wanted a unified India that would trade with the British, but the decision was made by the political leaders to split the country. As a result, millions of Indians had to relocate. if an Indian was Hindu, they had to move to the Hindu area of India, and if an Indian was Muslim, they had to move to Pakistan. And we have over 12 million Indians had to relocate. Now, while this was happening, violence occurred, and we call it a partition violence, to the order of anywhere from hundreds of thousands, upwards of 2 million Indians were killed in the violence that happened while families are relocating, while the country is splitting. To put it simply, there wasn't governmental oversight of the split. There wasn't a strong law enforcement. Local political leaders, regional political leaders stirred up religious tension between the religions of the areas, and people started to identify with the religion, to be angry at other religions, to take advantage of the lack of law enforcement, to take advantage of riots for economic gain and identity anger. People stopped seeing themselves as Indian and their neighbors as Indian and started seeing each other as religions, and that was being used by people in power to use the identity to fuel their own power grab and to fuel riots. Some sources say it wasn't necessarily neighbor versus neighbor, but it was chaos with different identities, oftentimes unknown to the victims, causing riots, causing violence and death. In the end, India was partitioned, and one area was left disputed between Pakistan and India. The area is called Kashmir, and that area never fully got satisfactorily divided between the two new governments, and it is still disputed today.